In the end, the most feared man in Spain died, begging for the mercy he never gave. His name was Tomás de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor, a man who built a legacy of terror by sending thousands to burn at the stake. But his final sanctuary, the very monastery he designed, was built on a Jewish cemeterian, the bones of the people he destroyed. In his last agonizing hours, the hunter had become the hunted, trapped not by walls, but by the crushing weight of his own deeds, haunted by the ghosts of a nation he had set aflame. This broken, terrified man wasn't born a monster. He was born into a family with Jewish blood in its own veins. So, how did a boy of converso heritage grow up to become the architect of the Spanish Inquisition, a symbol of religious persecution so absolute that his name would become a synonym for terror itself? The most vicious anti-Semite in Spanish history had Jewish blood. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who would dedicate his life to hunting down secret Jews, who would create a machine of terror to root out any trace of Hebrew heritage. Tomás de Torquemada was born in 1420 in Valladolid, into a family of conversos. That's the polite term. The real translation? Jews who had converted to Christianity to avoid persecution. Some converted with genuine faith. Others, well, they did what they had to do to survive. And in 15th century Spain, survival meant wearing a cross and forgetting your grandmother's prayers. But here's where it gets interesting. Young Tomás didn't just accept his Christian identity, he weaponized it. While other converso children might have felt torn between two worlds, Torquemada chose a different path. Total, absolute, fanatical devotion. Picture this: a teenage boy, denying himself food until his ribs show through his habit, sleeping on bare wood when everyone else has straw, whipping his own back until the blood runs. This wasn't normal piety. This was war. War against his own body. War against any whisper of his heritage that might still lurk in his blood. His uncle, Juan de Torquemada, watched this self-destruction with growing alarm. The uncle was everything. The nephew wasn't a cardinal, yes, but one who used his position to protect conversos. He believed in mercy, in understanding, in the possibility that people could genuinely transform their faith. He tried to teach young Tomás these lessons. The nephew listened. He nodded, and then he did the exact opposite. Where his uncle preached tolerance, Tomás saw weakness. Where the cardinal protected conversos, the nephew saw contamination that needed to be burned out. It was as if he looked at his uncle's compassion and thought, this is what's wrong with the church. This is why heresy spreads. By the time he entered the Dominican Order, Torquemada had transformed himself into something new, not just a Christian, but the most Christian, not just pure, but the purifier. Every prayer, every fast, every self-inflicted suffering was another brick in the wall he was building between himself and his past. The other monks whispered about him, this young brother who refused meat even on feast days, who spent entire nights prostrate on the cold stone floor, who seemed to find actual joy in deprivation. They thought he was remarkably holy. They had no idea they were watching a man trying to kill a part of himself. And maybe that's the key to understanding everything that came after. When you wage war on yourself, when you try to destroy something that's literally in your blood, that violence has to go somewhere. Torquemada couldn't cut the Jewish heritage out of his own veins, but he could cut it out of Spain. Think about the psychology of it. Every heretic he would later condemn, every family he would tear apart, every confession he would extract, was he seeing himself in them? Was each auto de fe a kind of proxy suicide, burning the part of himself he couldn't reach? The truly chilling part is how good he became at hiding this internal war. To the outside world, he was the perfect monk, austere, dedicated, incorruptible. When he spoke about the danger of false converts, about how they poisoned the pure body of Christ with their hidden Judaism, no one suspected he might be talking about himself. Because that's what hatred does. When you turn it inward, it doesn't disappear. It just looks for other targets. And Torquemada, having conquered his own body through deprivation and self-torture, was ready to turn that same ruthless control outward. He had purged himself. Now he would purge Spain. But personal fanaticism, no matter how intense, can only do so much. To reshape an entire nation, he needed power, real power, the kind that comes from the throne itself. And he found it in the confession booth of a young, impressionable princess who would one day rule half of Spain. Confess, my child. Those 3 words, whispered in the dim light of a confession booth, would reshape the fate of an entire nation. The voice belonged to Tomás de Torquemada. The child, though she was nearly a woman, was Isabella, future Queen of Castile, and in that sacred space, where sins were meant to be forgiven, something else was being born. An obsession that would consume Spain. Isabella was 17 when Torquemada became her confessor, pious, intelligent, and desperately trying to navigate the treacherous politics of the Castilian court. She needed guidance. She needed someone who could help her understand God's will in the chaos of royal intrigue. What she got was something far more dangerous, a mentor who would shape her conscience into a weapon. Here's the thing about confession in medieval times. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about formation. The confessor didn't just absolve sins. He shaped how you saw sin itself. And Torquemada was a master sculptor. Picture these sessions. Isabella, kneeling in the darkness, pouring out her fears, the succession crisis, the nobles who questioned her legitimacy, the constant threats to her power. And there, behind the screen, Torquemada's voice, calm, certain, absolute. Your Highness feels threatened by the nobles' rebellion? Consider who leads these rebellions. Often, those whose faith is uncertain. The conversos grow rich, while true Christians suffer. They claim to worship Christ but keep their Jewish gold. Is this not a sign? See what he did there? He took her political problems and gave them a spiritual diagnosis. Every threat to her power became a threat to the faith. Every enemy became a potential heretic. It was brilliant. It was subtle, and Isabella, desperate for clarity in a murky world, drank it in. Week after week, month after month, the lessons continued. Torquemada would tell her stories about kingdoms that fell because they tolerated heresy, about the danger of false converts who pretended to be Christian while secretly practicing Jewish rites, about how God punished rulers who failed to keep their realms pure. Remember King Sisbut, he would say, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. He allowed the Jews to remain, and God sent the Moors to punish Spain for 700 years. Only now are we taking back what is ours. Will you be the queen who completes God's work, or the one who lets it slip away again? The genius of Torquemada's manipulation was that he never commanded. He suggested. He guided. He let Isabella feel like these ideas were her own revelations. When she spoke of purifying Spain, she thought she was hearing God's voice. She was actually hearing Torquemada's. And he was patient, so patient. While other advisors pushed for immediate action, Torquemada played the long game. He knew that ideas planted young grow deep roots. He wasn't just advising a princess. He was programming a future queen. The transformation was gradual but complete. The young woman who had Jewish friends at court began to see them differently. Where once she saw loyal subjects, now she saw potential threats. Where once she heard different languages in the marketplace as signs of Castile's prosperity, now she heard the babble of Babel, a kingdom divided against itself. But Torquemada's masterstroke came when Isabella faced her greatest crisis. Her brother, King Henry IV, wanted her to marry against her will. The nobles were choosing sides. Civil war seemed inevitable. And in that moment of supreme vulnerability, when Isabella needed strength more than ever, Torquemada gave her a mission. God has preserved you for a purpose, he told her, not just to rule, but to purify, not just to govern, but to save souls. The heretics multiply in the shadows. The false converts mock the sacraments. Your brother is weak, tolerates this corruption, but you could be God's sword. It was exactly what she needed to hear, a cosmic purpose for her political ambition, a divine justification for seeking power. She wasn't just fighting for a throne, she was fighting for God himself. By the time Isabella took the crown, the transformation was complete. The confessor had become the architect of her conscience. And now, with a queen who saw heresy in every shadow, Torquemada was ready for the next phase. He had forged the will of the monarch, but a queen's will alone could not remake a kingdom. He needed a mechanism, a system, a trap so perfect that an entire nation would walk into it willingly. It started with a promise of mercy, but it was the most diabolical trap ever conceived. The year was 1481. Torquemada had just been appointed Grand Inquisitor, and his first official act was genius in its simplicity. He announced the Edict of Grace, a 30 to 40-day period where heretics could come forward, confess their sins, and receive forgiveness. No burning, no torture, just reconciliation with the Church. It sounded almost compassionate. It was anything but. Here's how the trap worked. The edict wasn't just offering mercy to those who confessed their own sins. There was a catcher, poisonous detail that would tear communities apart. To receive this grace, penitents had to provide complete information about anyone else they knew who was practicing heresy. Every friend, every neighbor, every family member. Imagine you're a converso in Seville. Maybe your conversion was genuine. Maybe it wasn't. But your neighbor saw you refuse pork at last week's market. Your sister-in-law noticed you lighting candles on Friday evening. Small things, meaningless things. Except now, those observations are loaded weapons. The clock starts ticking. Literally. In every church the edict is read aloud. Priests count down the days. 29 days of grace remaining. 28, 27. The entire city becomes a powder keg of paranoia. Let me paint you a picture of one family merchant, successful, respected. The father, Diego, converted 20 years ago. Genuine conversion, he tells himself. But his mother still refuses pork. His wife sometimes forgets and lights candles on the wrong day. His brother-in-law definitely still prays in Hebrew when he thinks no one is listening. Night falls. Diego and his wife, Maria, sit at their kitchen table. The candle between them flickers. "We have to go," Maria whispers. "Confess. Before someone else." "Confess what?" Diego's voice is sharp. "That my mother keeps kosher? That would kill her. And if the neighbors have already seen? If they confess first and name us?" The silence stretches. Outside, they hear footsteps. Just someone passing by. Probably. But every footstep sounds like an inquisitor now. "What about your brother?" Diego asks. Maria's face goes white. "I can't. If we don't, and they find out we knew." This is the beauty of Torquemada's trap. It doesn't matter if you're guilty or innocent. The moment that edict is announced, everyone becomes complicit. Know something and don't report it? You're as guilty as the heretic. Report it? You've just destroyed your community, your family, maybe yourself. 20 days left. The confessional lines grow longer. Brothers denounce brothers. Wives betray husbands. Children, coached by terrified parents, point fingers at grandparents. The Inquisition doesn't have to hunt for heretics. The community delivers them, wrapped in the bow of their own terror. But wait, it gets worse. Because Torquemada understands human nature. He knows that once the accusations start, they take on a life of their own. That merchant who cheated you last year? Well, didn't his family light candles strangely? That woman who rejected your son's marriage proposal? Someone should investigate her Friday night activities. 10 days left. The city is eating itself alive. Diego finally breaks. He goes to confess, to save his family. But when he arrives at the church, he sees his business partner emerging from the confessional, pale and shaking. Their eyes meet for one terrible second. Diego Noshi's name has already been spoken. 5 days left. The arrests begin. Not dramatic raids that would cause panic, resistance. Instead, quiet knocks at dawn. "You've been named. Come peacefully, and it will go easier." By the time the neighbors wake, another family has vanished into the Inquisition's cells. The true genius of the Edict of Grace? It made the victims complicit in their own destruction. It transformed an entire population into informants. It weaponized community bonds, turning love into liability, trust into danger. And here's the final twist. When the grace period ended, when the dust settled and the cells were full, Torquemada had more than just prisoners. He had names, thousands of names, networks of connections, a map of every converso family, every business relationship, every hidden sympathy. The trap was sprung, but Torquemada was just getting started, because now he had to determine who among these thousands was truly guilty. And for that, he needed a new kind of manual, a guidebook that could turn the most innocent daily routine into evidence of heresy. He was about to make ordinary life itself a crime. What if changing your bedsheets on a Friday could get you killed? For thousands in Spain, it did. Torquemada had his prisoners. Now he needed convictions. But here's the problem. How do you prove someone is secretly Jewish? You can't see faith, you can't touch belief, but you can observe behavior. And so Torquemada created something unprecedented, a detailed manual that transformed daily life into evidence. The Inquisitor's Handbook was a masterpiece of paranoid observation, every page filled with telltale signs of secret Judaism, not grand gestures or obvious rituals, those were too easy to avoid. Instead, Torquemada focused on the tiny, unconscious habits that are hardest to break. Listen to this list. Just listen. Putting on a clean shirt on Saturdays, washing hands before meals, removing blood from meat before cooking, lighting candles on Friday evening, avoiding pork or shellfish, naming children from the Old Testament, turning the dying to face the wall, washing the dead before burial. Normal things, human things, things that might just mean you like cleanliness or have dietary preferences or honor your dead with care. But in Torquemada's Spain, these became a checklist of damnation. Picture this scene. A modest home in Toledo. The mother, Esperanza, hums while she prepares Friday dinner. The sound of water as she rinses the meat. The soft scrape of a knife removing a blood spot. Her daughter helps, learning the recipes passed down from grandmother to mother to child. Now freeze that scene. Add an observer. Maybe a servant. Maybe a neighbor peering through a window. Maybe a child who doesn't understand what they're seeing but will remember it later. That innocent kitchen becomes a crime scene. That humming mother, a suspect. The Inquisition's genius was making everyone an expert witness. They published the signs, announced them from pulpits. Suddenly, every Spaniard knew what to look for. Your neighbor's wife always does laundry on Fridays? Suspicious. That merchant seems to avoid the butcher shop that sells pork? Worth noting. The old woman down the street was seen pouring out wine while muttering? Could be Jewish blessings. But here's where it becomes truly insidious. Many of these practices weren't even exclusively Jewish. Washing hands before meals? That's just hygiene. Changing sheets weekly? Basic cleanliness. But context became everything. Do it on the wrong day, in the wrong way, with the wrong expression on your face, and suddenly you're a heretic. The interrogations were masterclasses in psychological manipulation. An inquisitor would start gently, almost conversationally. Tell me about your household routines. When do you typically clean? What does your family eat on Fridays? Simple questions, innocent questions, unless you knew that every answer was being weighed against that secret checklist. Say you clean on Fridays, and a note gets made. Say you don't eat pork because it upsets your stomach, another note. Enough notes, and you have a pattern. Enough patterns, and you have a conviction. The cruelest part? Many conversos had genuinely embraced Christianity, but kept some old customs out of habit or family tradition, like keeping a recipe your grandmother taught you, like lighting candles the way your mother did. These weren't acts of faith, they were acts of love, of memory, but memory itself had become criminal. The manual grew more detailed with each edition. Inquisitors added new signs as they discovered them, refusing to eat food cooked in lard, calling children by Hebrew names in private, celebrating any joy or mourning on days that coincided with Jewish holiday 7 by accident, dying without calling for a priest, looking sad on Sundays, looking happy on Saturdays. Think about that last one. Looking happy on the wrong day of the week could kill you. The effect on daily life was suffocating. Conversos began to overthink every action. They ate pork publicly, even if it made them sick. They made sure neighbors saw them working on Saturdays. They hung crosses in every room, attended Mass daily, volunteered for church committees, anything to appear more Christian than the Christians. But paranoia is exhausting. Eventually, people slip. They forget which day they're not supposed to clean. They accidentally use an old family expression. They flinch at the taste of pork after forcing it down for years. And someone is always watching, always noting, always ready to report. The checklist had done its work. Daily life itself had become evidence. But accusations and circumstantial evidence could only go so far. For those who refused to confess, Torquemada had prepared something special, a process so refined, so coldly bureaucratic, that it turned torture into a medical procedure. In the dungeons of the Inquisition, the most terrifying man in the room wasn't the torturer, it was the doctor. Let that sink in. In those stone chambers beneath Toledo, Seville, and Valencia, where Spain's condemned waited in darkness, the arrival of a physician meant something had gone horribly wrong with the very concept of medicine. The healers had become calibrators of suffering. Torquemada didn't invent torture, but he perfected its bureaucracy. He transformed it from chaotic cruelty into something far more terrifying, a regulated system with rules, procedures, and medical supervision, because in his twisted logic, this wasn't about sadism. It was about salvation. The pain was just a tool to extract truth, and like any tool, it needed to be used properly. The rules were precise. Torture could only be applied once officially. Blood couldn't be shed officially. The victim couldn't be permanently maimed officially. These weren't merciful restrictions. They were guidelines for maximum efficiency. And to ensure these guidelines were followed, every torture session required a doctor. Picture the scene. A stone room, windowless, lit by torches. The accused sits bound to a chair. Around them stand the tribunal, the inquisitor in his black robes, the notary with his quill ready to record every word, the executioner with his tools laid out like a craftsman's workshop. And there, standing slightly apart, the doctor, clean hands, calm demeanor, taking a pulse with the same detached professionalism he might show at a noble's bedside. The water torture, they called it, the toca was Torquemada's preferred method. Listen to how clinically it worked. The victim is tied to a ladder, tilted back, mouth forced open. A cloth is placed over the face. Water is poured slowly, steadily, not enough to drown quickly that would defeat the purpose, just enough to create the sensation of drowning, over and over again. And through it all, the doctor watches. He checks the pulse, observes the breathing, notes the color of the skin. When the victim's body begins to convulse too violently, he raises a hand. The water stops, not out of mercute of calculation. Push too hard, too fast, and you get unconsciousness or death. Neither produces confessions. Give them a moment, the doctor says quietly. Professional, detached, like he's managing a difficult medical procedure. The victim gasps, coughs, struggles for air. The notary's quill scratches, recording the pause, the duration, the response, everything documented, everything legal. When the doctor nods, it begins again. This medicalization of torture served multiple purposes. First, it allowed the Inquisition to claim they followed strict guidelines. See, we have doctors present. We follow procedures. We're not barbarians. Second, it maximized the effectiveness. The doctor's expertise meant they could push victims to the absolute limit without killing them, without leaving marks that would be embarrassing at the auto da fe. But most importantly, it corrupted an entire profession. These weren't back-alley torturers. These were trained physicians who had taken oaths to do no harm. Yet here they stood, using their knowledge of human anatomy to advise on how much pain a body could take. They became experts in suffering. The psychological effect on victims was devastating. The presence of a doctor, someone who should represent healing and care, transformed the torture chamber into a perverse medical theatre. It gave the proceedings a veneer of rationality, of process, that made it somehow worse than simple brutality. And the doctors kept notes. Clinical observations about which methods produced confessions fastest, which types of people broke first. How to read the signs that someone was about to confess versus someone who would die before speaking. These notes were shared between Inquisition offices, creating a standardized manual of medicalized cruelty. The most chilling part? Many of these doctors likely believed they were doing good. In the twisted logic of the Inquisition, forcing a confession meant saving a soul. The temporary pain of the body was nothing compared to the eternal torment of hellfire. So they stood there, pulse in hand, watching suffering with the same detachment they'd show treating a fever. This was Torquemada's true genius. Not the violence itself, but the system that made violence respectable, professional, medical. He had created a machine that could manufacture confessions with the efficiency of a workshop, all while maintaining the fiction of law and order. The system was now complete. He had the accusations, the evidence, the confessions. But to achieve his ultimate vision, Spain entirely free of Jewish influence, he needed something more. He needed the entire nation to unite in hatred. He needed a story so powerful it would justify the unthinkable. They killed the child, the holy child. The whisper spread through the marketplace of LaGuardia like fire through dry wheat. A Christian boy, innocent, pure, had been kidnapped by Jews and conversos, tortured in mockery of Christ's passion. His blood drained for their dark rituals. It was the story Spain had been waiting for, the perfect justification for what came next. Except the child never existed. This was Torquemada's masterstroke, his greatest piece of propaganda, the Holy Child of La Guardia, a blood libel so effective that it would push Spain over the edge into full expulsion. No body was ever found. No child was reported missing. But in the torture chambers of the Inquisition, confessions were extracted that painted a picture of such horror that facts became irrelevant. Here's how brilliant the timing was. It's 1491. Ferdinand and Isabella have just conquered Granada, the last Muslim stronghold. Spain is unified under Christian rule for the first time in 8 centuries. The monarchs are broke from the war but drunk on victory. And the Jewish community, sensing danger, is desperately trying to prove their loyalty. Into this powder keg, Torquemada drops his match. The trial of the conspirators in the Holy Child case becomes a public spectacle. The confessions extracted through torture, contradictory, impossible are read aloud in every church. Jews and conversos together, the story goes, crucified this innocent child in hatred of Christ. The details grow more lurid with each telling. But Torquemada knows that horror alone isn't enough. He needs to make it political, economic, personal to the monarchs. So he waits. He lets the story spread, lets the outrage build. And then, when the moment is perfect, he strikes. The scene is the royal palace in Granada. Ferdinand and Isabella are meeting with Abraham Sr. and Isaac Abravanel, the leaders of the Jewish community. These aren't just any Jews there, royal financiers, advisors, men who helped fund the very war that unified Spain. They've come with an offer. Gold. Lots of it. 30,000 ducats to the royal treasury, if the monarchs will refuse the calls for expulsion. The negotiations are going well. Ferdinand, ever practical, sees the value. That gold could fund his Italian ambitions. Isabella wavers. These men served her faithfully. Their community has been in Spain for over 1,000 years. Maybe there's another way. Then the doors burst open. Torquemada enters like an avenging angel. In his hand, a crucifix. His eyes blaze with righteous fury. The room falls silent. Even the monarchs seem to shrink before their confessor's rage. He raises the crucifix high and speaks. Judas sold Christ for 30 pieces of silver. Will your highnesses sell him again for 30,000? The words hang in the air like a thunderclap. Then, with a gesture of supreme contempt, he throws the crucifix on the table between the monarchs and the Jewish leaders. It clatters against the wood, the sound sharp, final, damning. There he is, Torquemada continues, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Sell him if you will, but know that you will answer for it before God. And then he turns and walks out, leaving chaos in his wake. Feel the power dynamics in that room. The Jewish leaders, moments before negotiating as equals, now marked as the descendants of Judas. The monarchs, caught between greed and the fear of damnation. The crucifix on the table, a silent accusation. Isabella breaks first. How can she, the Catholic monarch, defender of the faith, take Jewish gold? Wouldn't that make her complicit in the betrayal of Christ? Ferdinand, seeing his wife's resolve, knows the battle is lost. The political calculation is clear. They've just won a holy war against the Muslims. They can't be seen as selling out to the Jews. The silence stretches. Abraham Sr. and Isaac Abravanel know their fate is sealed. They gather their papers, their offers, their dignity, and leave. Within days, the Edict of Expulsion will be signed. But here's the detail that shows Torquemada's true nature. He didn't just want the Jews gone, he wanted them destroyed. The edict gave them 4 months to convert or leave. But they couldn't take gold or silver. They had to sell everything: homes, businesses, possessions accumulated over centuries in a buyer's market where everyone knew they had no choice. Torquemada had orchestrated it all. The blood libel to inflame the people, the dramatic scene to shame the monarchs, the terms of expulsion designed for maximum cruelty. He had won. Spain would be purely Christian, and as his reward, he would receive the Jewish cemetery of Avila, where he would build his final home. They were given a choice: convert or leave. But it wasn't a choice at all. July 31st, 1492, the same year Columbus would stumble upon a new world, Spain was destroying an old one. The Edict of Expulsion gave Spain's Jews 4 months to abandon homes their families had known for 40 generations. The cruel arithmetic was simple: stay and betray your faith, or leave and lose everything. Picture the scene in any Jewish quarter that summer. Families huddled around kitchen tables, voices low and urgent, parents trying to explain to children why they have to leave the only home they've ever known. The sound of hammers as people board up shops that have been in their families for centuries. The scratch of quills as desperate sellers accept whatever pittance buyers offer. Because here's Torquemada's final cruelty: they couldn't take their wealth. No gold, no silver. Only what they could carry or trade for goods. Overnight, successful merchants became beggars. Skilled physicians were reduced to trading medical knowledge for bread. Entire libraries, repositories of centuries of learning, sold for the price of passage on a ship. The Christians watched like vultures. Why pay fair price for a house when the seller has to leave in 3 months? Why offer real value for a business when desperation drives the price down daily? The economic violence was as calculated as any torture chamber. Torquemada had engineered a transfer of wealth that would destroy the Jewish community, even if they'd been allowed to stay. But it's the human details that break your heart. Elderly parents too frail to travel, choosing conversion to avoid burdening their fleeing children. Families split forever at crossroads, some choosing exile, others choosing baptism. The Portuguese border, where guards turned back refugees unless they paid bribes that left them with nothing. The ship's captains who took payment, then dumped their passengers on deserted African coasts. And through it all, Torquemada watched with satisfaction. His life's work was nearly complete. Spain was being purified. The converts who remained would be under constant surveillance, their every move scrutinized by his Inquisition. The Jews who left would never return. He had won. Which brings us to his reward. Ferdinand and Isabella, grateful for his service, offered him anything. Wealth? He lived like a pauper. Power? He had all he needed. Land? He wanted only one thing: the Jewish cemetery in Avila. Think about that request. Of all the rewards a man could claim, he chose a graveyard. Not just any graveyard, a Jewish one. The place where generations had been laid to rest with prayers he'd spent his life trying to eradicate. And on this ground, soaked with the memory of the people he'd destroyed, he built his monastery. His sanctuary. His home. The symbolism is almost too heavy-handed to believe. Every stone of that monastery pressed down on Jewish graves. Every prayer offered in its chapel rose from soil consecrated by rabbis. He had literally built his peace on the bones of his enemies. The man who began by trying to destroy the Jewish heritage in his own blood ended by living atop a Jewish cemetery. The workers who built it whispered about strange sounds at night. Not ghosts. Torquemada didn't believe in such superstitions, but perhaps something worse. The weight of irony so profound it could crack stone. A man of Jewish descent, living above Jewish dead, in a building dedicated to a god both communities claimed to serve. In his final years, Torquemada rarely left the monastery. Age and perhaps conscience kept him confined to those walls. He still wore his simple habit, still slept on his wooden board, still refused meat. But visitors noticed something newer: restlessness. He would walk the corridors at night, lips moving in constant prayer, not peaceful prayer, urgent, desperate, as if he was arguing with someone only he could see. The monastery was quiet, too quiet. Built for contemplation, it became a prison of memory. Every footstep echoed off stones that covered older stones, Jewish stones, carved with Hebrew letters he'd taught Spain to fear. He had achieved everything he wanted. Spain was pure. The heretics were gone or silenced. The Inquisition ran like clockwork, processing suspects with bureaucratic efficiency. He should have been at peace. He had done God's work. He had saved Spain. He had built his sanctuary. But sanctuaries built on graves have a way of becoming tombs. And now, in his final hours, as his breath rattled in his chest and his fingers clutched at rough wool, Tomás de Torquemada was about to discover what mercy meant to a man who had shown none. And so we return to where we began, the monastery at Avila, the dying man on his wooden board, the whispered prayers that sound more like pleas: mercy, mercy. But now you understand what those words really mean. This isn't just an old man afraid of death. This is Torquemada realizing, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what he's done. 15 years as Grand Inquisitor, thousands sent to the flames, hundreds of thousands driven from their homes, families destroyed, communities erased, all in the name of purity, all in the name of God. The monastery walls can't keep out what haunts him now, not ghost something worse. Memory, every face that passed through his courtrooms, every confession extracted in his chambers, every family that stood at Spain's borders, looking back one last time at the only home they'd ever known. They're all here with him now, in these final hours. Here's what makes it truly tragic. He still believes he was right. Even now, gasping for air, drowning in his own legacy, he can't admit error. The mercy he begs for isn't forgiveness for being wrong. It's terror that he might have been too lenient, that some secret heretic might have escaped his net, that Spain might not be pure enough. Because that's what happens when you build your identity on hatred of a part of yourself. The war never ends. The enemy can never be fully defeated because the enemy is you. Every Jew he expelled, every converso he burned, was just another battle in a war against his own blood. And now, at the very end, he's still fighting. Still trying to prove his purity to a God he's about to meet. The irony is perfect, terrible, complete. The Grand Inquisitor, who showed no mercy, begging for it. The man who built his sanctuary on Jewish graves, unable to find peace. The judge who accepted no excuses, making his final plea. He's become his own last victim, tortured not by water or fire, but by the weight of his own choices. They say he died, clutching his crucifix, the same one he threw on the table before Ferdinand and Isabella, the same one he held while pronouncing sentence on thousands. Did it bring him comfort? Or did it feel as heavy as the stones of his monastery, each one pressing down on the bones beneath? His last words were a prayer, not for his soul, for Spain, for the continuation of his work, for the eternal vigilance against heresy. Even in death, he couldn't stop. The machine he built would outlive him by centuries, grinding on with bureaucratic efficiency long after its architect was dust. But here's the final twist. The Inquisition he perfected would eventually turn on his own memory. Later, historians would discover the truth about his converso heritage. The pure-blood fanatic had Jewish ancestry. The Grand Purifier was himself impure by his own standards. If he had lived to face his own Inquisition, he would have failed his own tests. Torquemada died on September 16th, 1498, in his monastery built on graves. They buried him in sacred ground, with all the ceremony due to a defender of the faith. But somewhere beneath those same stones lay older bones, witnesses to a different faith, a different Spain, a world he had destroyed in trying to destroy himself. The screaming stopped. The silence that followed was worse, because in that silence, 15,000 victims had their say, and their verdict on the Grand Inquisitor's plea for mercy. History has already delivered it.